One of the biggest problems that we see consistently with the believability of the Old Testament is the huge numbers that are quoted, often in military campaigns, usually in military campaigns. And some of these numbers seem just so incredibly vast and huge that they're just inappropriate, and it looks as though somebody lied. You need to understand that there's probably a really good, logical, common sense reason why the numbers seem to be a whole lot bigger than they are, and it has nothing to do with the fact that there were that many people involved. But we need a little bit of background here so you understand where the numbers came from. And you need to understand how the words for the numbers came about. In ancient Hebrew, when they didn't write the numbers in the Torah, the Old Testament part, first 5 books of Moses, which is the part of the Old Testament we're doing now, in numbers. They wrote the numbers as words, as we would write 8, and we could use a number, or we could use a word, E-I-G-H-T. Or we could write 80, E-I-G-H-T-Y. And the reason I pick those two numbers is very simple. If you, in Hebrew, in the Old Hebrew, they left out all the vowels. So all you had was the consonants. If you take 8 and 80 and you leave out all the vowels, you have exactly the same letters. And you could be talking about 8 people or 8 dogs or $8, or you could be talking about 80 people or 80 dogs or $80. And there'd be no way of knowing. And we think this is part of the problem that the copyists had. Now, you need to understand that the people who were copying the Torah took that incredibly seriously and did a fabulous, phenomenal job. And as we're looking back at copies of these things, the number of changes from the very first ones we have to the very latest ones are almost negligible. The numbers of change, I mean, they developed systems to check the accuracy of these things down to the individual letter. They took this very seriously. They also didn't question, at least enough to make changes, because they weren't authorized to make the changes, they felt, a thing that they didn't understand. And we think that was the problem with the numbers. Now, give you an idea of why we know there were problems. And I know I drive some of the literalists on the Bible just stark raving mad, but the point is, it is not literally correct. We know it's not literally correct because we know there are mistakes. Give you an idea. In 2 Samuel chapter 10, verse 18, they're talking about an army, and the army has, in that account, 700 chariots. In 1 Chronicles chapter 19, verse 18, they're talking about the same situation, same army, only there are 7,000 chariots. At one particular point, they're talking in another set of scriptures. They're talking about a king of Israel who comes to being king at the age of 18. In another duplicate account, he's 8. Well, he's either 8 or 18. But if somebody leaves out one number, it makes a great deal of difference. If there's difference between 10,000 and 100,000, is an awful big difference. Now, in all the new Hebrew Bibles, all the new Hebrew Torah, all the rest of it, they spell out all the words with every letter. But in those days, they left out all the vowels. And so if you didn't know exactly what you were doing, if you didn't know the context in which it was, if you didn't know the story yourself, you had to guess. Give you an idea. There are 2 words which are very similar in Hebrew when you leave out the vowels. One is in English would be spelled E-L-E-P-H, elf, and another one is A-L-L-U-P-H. And if you leave out the vowels from Aleph, you have L-P, H. If you leave out the vowels in Aleph, A-L-L-U-P-H, you have L-L-P-H. And sometimes the transcribers, the copyists, would leave out the duplicate L. Why put it in? There's 2, whatever. The problem is that they mean different things. The word Aleph, E-L-E-P-H, is the standard word in the military use for the word 1,000. But used in other contexts, it could mean family or clan. Big deal difference. If you have 1,000 people, that's a little different than having a family with 3 or 4 kids. Now, Aleph, A-L-L-U-P-H, is used in the scriptures, and it refers to one of 2 things. Number 1, a commander of 1,000 of the Edomite soldiers. So it's one man, but he's a commander of 1,000. Or it refers in Hebrew to a trained professional soldier with armor and a sword. So if somebody says, as in this, there's a thing about, let's see, in 2 Judges, I think, 2 Judges chapter 20, or Judges, sorry, chapter 20, verse 2. There is a story about an attack on a village, I mean literally a village called Gibeah. And according to the translation of it, there were 400,000 foot soldiers who drew the sword. But you don't need 400,000 people for a village. You wouldn't send 400,000 people for a village. Here's what it probably means. 400 professional soldiers with swords. Because who's fighting them? We look at who's fighting them, and there are 26 members of the tribe of Benjamin with swords and 700 with slings. And in the Old Testament times, there were 2 categories of soldiers. The professional soldiers who had the swords and the amateur soldiers who were the farmers and the shepherds who had the slings. Now, if you had 400,000 against 726 guys, that's what the total was on the tribe of Benjamin, the battle wouldn't last 20 minutes. You could send 1,000 guys against them and that would be it. The battle would be over. You could surround them and just wipe them out. But we have the story of the battle lasts for 3 days. And the first day, the Benjaminites lose 22 guys. The next day, they lose another 18. And the third day, they set up an ambush. How are you going to ambush 400,000 guys? You can't. And it says that the ambush is led by 10,000. But what it probably means is 10 commanders, 10 special preferred soldiers, 10 guys. Because in the place where they're supposedly hiding, you can't hide 10,000 people. So, that basically tells us that we need to understand. And here's where we think the problem really occurred. We think there was a mixing up between the military rank of commanders as though the number of people they commanded, or their rank, was the number of people involved in the battle. So for instance, if you said, and then multiplied out. So if, for instance, you had 5 commanders of 100 and 2 commanders of 1,000, that didn't give you 200,000 or 100,000 or anything else. That was just the commanders that you had. And we know that in the British Army and the Canadian Army and very often in the U.S. Army, you have a staff of officers and trainers. And in military times, you then bring in a large number of men. But just because you have a general doesn't mean you have 1,000 or 10,000 men in the field. You got to have a general and he's there in a Jeep with his driver. He doesn't have 10,000 guys with him. And so that's what we think the problem was. And so the people who were doing the copying were very sincere. But over time, the meaning of what it was got lost. And then as it was translated into English from the Hebrew and other languages, the numbers just had no bearing on reality.